What is up, everyone? Today I'm speaking with Salim Ismail on exponential organizations, innovation, how to start a startup, how to find your massively transformative purpose, and so much more. So, Salim is a sought after business strategist who presents globally to the leaders of many of the world's largest companies and heads of state. He's been featured across many media outlets, including the New York Times, Bloomberg, Fortune, Forbes, Wired, Vogue, Fox Business, and the BBC. Part of Salim's magnetism is that he speaks from experience in transforming companies. So Salim is the founder and chairman of EXO Works and OpenEXO, which help companies implement the lessons from his book, Exponential Organizations, by emulating the world's fastest growing companies. Exponential Organizations is a wildly popular entrepreneurship book that takes a deep dive into the world's most successful tech companies and that are growing at exponential rates. I highly recommend you guys read this book, and you'll also get a snippet of what that book discusses in this episode. So Salim calls them exponential organization or EXOs because these organizations are characterized by an impact or output that is at least 10 times larger compared to its peers due to the use of new operational techniques that leverage accelerating and exponential technologies, such as AI, blockchain, and many more. So, in other words, these organizations grow faster, bigger, and cheaper than its competitors because they have a massively transformative purpose and they scale as quickly as tech does. So Salim's companies inspire innovators to replace incremental innovation with 10x improvement by implementing groundbreaking technologies and profitably achieving large-scale social impact. As a result, the company Salim has helped have created billions of dollars of return on investment for many different companies. Salim is a serial entrepreneur. Most recently, he founded OpenEXO, but he's previously founded several technology companies, including the New York Grant Company, PubSnub, Concepts, Fast Track Institute, and Angstro, which Google acquired in 2010. In addition, he led Brickhouse, which was Yahoo's internal incubator. He was also the founding executive director of Singularity University and is a board member of the X Prize Foundation. These associations give him extraordinary access to the most influential innovators of our time, plus technologies and business ideas while they are in stealth mode. Salim's quantum physics and philosophy education, combined with his career experience, gives him a unique macro vision of how the institutions that underpin our society and economy are broken and should be fixed. Before we dive in, though, I want to inject a fun personal anecdote. So, on the day that I interviewed Salim, I got the news that my team at Meta, aka Facebook, was going to be shut down 3 hours before our conversation. I was on the learning team and we were building a new learning surface on the Facebook app where anybody would be able to teach and learn from a class on any topic, like making for the Facebook app a place where people go to learn. Very bold mission. I really love the team, so I was pretty disheartened by the news when I heard it. But knowing that I was going to interview Salim helped me shift my state of mind. Because Salim often talks about the issue with large companies having what he calls a corporate immune system that attacks any new ideas that pose a threat to the core business of the company. So, firstly, more context. Our team was shut down for two main reasons. Firstly, we're not hiring as many engineers as we would like. Like, in other words, the demand for high quality engineering talent is much higher than the supply. And this is actually true across the entire tech industry, not just for Meta. And then the second reason is that Facebook rebranded to Meta, which means that a significant portion of the limited resources that we do have are now being allocated to top company priorities, such as building the metaverse. There's other priorities, but the metaverse is definitely top of mind. So really, when I look back and analyze this decision, it turns out that Meta decided to kill a great idea, this learning initiative, that would further increase the value of the Facebook app, which is the app where the source of Facebook's core business exists, the ads business. And they kill this good idea in order to pursue a big bet on where the future is going, the metaverse. So this is a big lesson in realizing that the companies that fail are the ones that fail to disrupt themselves. And I grew to respect the decision that Meta made because they were taking the risk that is required for them to continue to prosper in this infinite long-term game. And man, what an insane moment of synchronicity to interview Salim right after that had happened. The man himself that talks about the corporate immune system. So, in any case, I'm Julian Alvarez, and I'm a software engineer at Meta and a Gen Z entrepreneur, where I currently am the co-founder and CTO at a startup named Vise. You're listening to the Inventing the Future podcast, where our mission is to introduce you to the ideas and people that will inspire and empower you to solve the world's biggest problems. With that, let's go ahead and dive into the conversation with Salim.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode. I have Salim as my very special guest today, and I'm super excited for this episode because Salim is one of the people I've learned the most from, and definitely the guest that I've learned the most from. So it's an absolute privilege to have you on the show, Salim. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. So, Salim, to start off, I think it would be great to hear a bit more about your story and how you got into entrepreneurship and why you eventually decided to make this insane decision to make an entrepreneur when you could have chose to live a much more comfortable life.
Yeah, it's a totally irrational decision, isn't it? So I grew up in India and I did my schooling in university in Canada. I went to Waterloo, the big tech university up in Canada. And I ran out of money one of my semesters, and I was making chili and selling it to people around me to make some money. And so that was kind of like the starting point, with necessity being the mother of invention. And then I took a course on technical entrepreneurship, and I went, wow, people can actually create a business out of nothing. And that was kind of the starting point. I then went on to do computing for big companies, building large scale architectures, and then management consulting. I got to the US 20 years ago and started building companies. And my most notable was I built the predecessor to Twitter 2 years too early. In the tech space, very bad to be early, much better to be late. But it got me well known, and that's where the journey started. After that company, I went and joined Yahoo, became the head of innovation there, and we scanned 3,000 ideas. And our job was, at any point we should be building the best five. So that was an incredible amount of fun. Then I did Singularity University, wrote the book, and now I'm trying to build an ecosystem around the book. So I'm pretty confused overall.
You're pretty confused. Why are you confused? What do you mean
Well,
by
just
that?
because I've done so many different things, I can kind of pretend to sit on many different. I've had many hats, so that's probably why I'm bold.
How do you choose what hat to wear when there's so many to wear and so many you want to wear?
So I think maybe the most important piece that then lends into your thinking is one of the things we coined, terms we coined in the Exponential Organizations book, is the idea of a massive transformative purpose. Right? What
Right.
fundamental problem do you want to solve that you'd wake up at 6 a.m. every morning to try and crack? And we saw that every one of these EXOs, as we call it, had that MTP. Uber is everybody's private driver, and Google has organized the world's information, etc. And the mind became transform civilization. And so I've been setting up structures and ecosystems to try and do that. And that becomes super exciting, very obviously very hard. And in an ideal world, you never actually meet the goal, but it sets you on the right track. And so that's kind of the guiding light for me in terms of what projects to take on or not, which ones have the biggest impact on transformation.
Interesting. Do you have a specific way in which you think about measuring that? Because I'm sure like a lot of projects could transform civilization. How do you gauge which ones could potentially transform it the most?
Yeah, it's the metric side of it is very tough, especially when you have something as kind of grandiose as that.
Mm,
Where I've kind of settled overall is two things. One is that there's tons of technology coming along, and there's tons of startups coming along, and so
mm,
building a particular startup in a particular domain, like say energy or healthcare, would make a massive difference. Where I think I can add the most value is to solve that immune system problem, because every big company has difficulty innovating because the legacy environment doesn't like it. All our organizations are built for efficiency and for predictability, right? And you come in from the side trying to do something radically different, and they can't handle it. But it's much worse in the public sector, because there you have regulatory and policy, and we have bankers fighting Bitcoin, we have taxis fighting Uber, and we're just not progressing society along fast enough because we have this legacy thinking, and we have the conservative element in every religion is trying to take us backward, right? And that's not necessarily the best path. And so we've worked a lot on how do you solve the legacy resistance and how do you break that immune system problem, and that's essentially the ecosystem that I'm working on right now. And we've kind of cracked it. We've come up with a 10-week process that breaks the immune system in big companies, and we've also got a nonprofit that does the same thing in the public sector at a city level.
Right. Yeah. So to clarify for people, the immune system problem being that basically if you have some radical new idea, the corporate immune system or any other sort of immune system is going to tackle that, fight it off, and kind of stick to what is most comfortable and best known, or like the core business. Right. So the question is, how do you fight against that? One thing I'm curious about is how how different is the corporate immune system from other immune systems you see around the world, like in financial sectors, and does the solution vary significantly?
It does in because you've got a much stickier approach. It's easiest in a big company because everybody's profit motive is the same, and people can be aligned around something, right? So if you can show them that, hey, there's a better path, and you can structure yourselves on this better path and organize in a new way. Like, for example, don't do disruptive innovation in the core organization, do it at the edge and spin them off. And Nestle spinning off Nespresso is a good example. For instance, don't try and do that internally. And we're seeing this with, like, for example, Facebook is turning into an ecosystem of Instagram and WhatsApp, etc., and build out that way, right? Uh, um, the That's the private sector side. The public sector is much harder because you have to change regulatory, you have to change policy, and that's much harder. But we figured out how to do it. Our process takes 10 weeks in big companies, 16 weeks in public sector. A lot of the buzz you hear around Miami these days is partly because we ran a big project with the mayor 3 years ago and laid down a lot of the vocabulary you see coming out of it now, so we can see how we can make a difference there. The next level is academia, which has a really bad immune system, and try
Oof.
and do change academia, and probably the worst immune system in the world is religion, where they'll pretty much kill you if you don't adhere to the principles, and that's kind of a bit of an extreme. I've actually done a workshop at the Vatican because they
Whoa.
called up and they said the Pope has the worst immune system ever. Can we get your advice? And I actually ran a workshop with the top 80 senior mass leaders at the Vatican, which was interesting.
My God, how did they react? Especially the people most likely to react in antagonistic to
Actually, it
that.
was a very rich discussion, and they were much more open to it than I thought.
Hmm.
And actually, the Catholic Church is like the original exponential organization, right? The massive purpose is God. It's decentralized. It's resilient. It's
Wow.
gamified. It has ritual, etc. A lot of the techniques we talk about, and maybe that's the reason it's lasted so long. But the fundamental thesis, you could argue, is a little bit out of date, and they have difficulty keeping up, right? And so one of the challenges, for example, I talked to the main Monsignor after this, and he said, look, about 40% of what you said is heresy, and it means we're not allowed to talk about it because it goes against the church, and we're not even allowed to discuss it. So their immune system is like built right in a funny way.
Wow, that is so fascinating. That's super cool. So, I want to dive into exos, but exponential organizations. But before we do that, I have one last question here around the ecosystems that you analyze. Right. So you say you basically in civilization, transforming civilization. There's all these ecosystems, and I've learned a lot about systems thinking as of late, and yeah, it's basically like there's so many complex systems and ecosystems. How do you like conceptualize or try to analyze the relationships between things, and do you think about this in a systemic way? Because last thing I'll mention is I've heard of the phrase that some of the world's biggest problems are systemic problems and they require systemic solutions.
You're 100% on the right track there. We have a systems issue, and all of the systems that we used to run the world are geared for an older time, right?
Mm,
One of the huge distinctions that Peter has made is that almost everything in the world up till now was based on scarcity. And now we have technology delivering abundance, and we manage abundance in a very different way. For example, every business in the world for 10,000 years has been trying to sell scarcity, right? If you didn't have scarcity, you pretty much didn't have a business. So you'd get an asset or a workforce, you'd put a legal boundary around that and sell access to scarcity. A hotel on a beach, a great chef, a great designing team, and you'd kind of sell access to that. Now we have abundance coming along, and you have companies like Facebook that are managing an abundance of social media input, or Google managing an abundance of websites, etc. And we're learning how to create business models around abundance. Uber is tapping into an abundance of cars lying around, right? And so that's just starting, and that's a complete inflection point from the old way. Solar energy is going to deliver us an abundance of energy within 10 years, and that will completely take out the oil industry. And so that's kind of tricky for many countries, which are oil producing nations. And so we need to navigate that transition. Now, the challenge when you have that transition is our institutions aren't set up for it. And
mm,
what we are working on is how do you transform our institutions? Education, journalism, monetary systems, legal systems, healthcare systems. And again, I'll use the word systems because it's systemic change you need to evolve. What we're trying to do is create the tool set to inspire systemic change and then
wow.
let people pull down those tools as they need to. For example, with our 10-week process to transform companies, we've actually open sourced that. We wrote a second book saying, here's how you do it. Anybody can go now run that. And as we develop these tools for transforming companies, public sector environments, etc., we'll open source them. So anybody, if they have a bad immune system response somewhere, can pull down that tool set and run the process. So we think what we need is a complete sea change in the way we think about the world. I think this next 20, 30 years is the most important 20, 30 years in human history
Yeah.
because we have a huge inflection point coming, and either we come out the other side either as a Mad Max world or a Star Trek world,
Hmm.
right? And the politicians are sending us straight down a Mad Max world. You look at the rhetoric coming from a Trump or a Bolsonaro, etc., and yet technology is delivering abundance. And so navigating that is really the work to do. And how can we get that transition happening in as elegant a way as possible?
Yeah, that's beautiful. When you talk about transforming systems, is it really just a matter of trying to restructure the existing system, or is it a matter of creating something entirely new that's better and proving that it's better and hoping people adopt? Or does
It's
it depend?
it's the latter. What we found through history is you can never, ever, ever fix the old.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
the only way to do it is to go to the edge of the existing system, build a new capability, and let people migrate to it, and let that become the new gravity center. Okay? That's the only way. And so in big companies, we basically say, do not try and do disruptive innovation in the mothership. Create an edge organization and do it at the edge, and let that become the new gravity center. Um, I'll give you a quick little story. Walmart about
Mm.
10 years ago realized they had to compete with Amazon, that this whole e-commerce thing was not a fad. So they set up a team at headquarters and said, let's go beat Amazon. 18 months later, it was dead. The immune system had killed it. So they did it a second time, put the team at the edge of the company, but within 18 months, the executives figured it out and killed that. They did it a third time and said, um, go to the edge and build your own independent supply chain, distribution, inventory systems, even though we have the best in the world because we have to crack it. Started to succeed. The company brought it back in and killed it. It was on the fourth attempt they finally got it right, separately, independently, and only after it reached its own critical mass did they start connecting the back ends together, right? And the lesson I take from that is that it's just really hard. In the entire business history of business, we've never had to do that, and now that's the only path forward. So it's like trying to teach an old dog new tricks. Much better to grow a puppy and teach that thing new ideas. Um,
Hmm.
and so we found that you have to build new systems at the edge and migrate to those new systems. And so how do we do that in journalism or monetary systems or the future of education is the work we're thinking about.
Wow.
Buckminster Fuller actually summarized that pretty well in some of the thinking he did.
Wow, that is brilliant thinking. Yeah. So create new systems, um, which is easier to do than fixing new ones. And I think for companies, the hardest thing is trying to acknowledge that what's going to help them succeed is to try and disrupt themselves
Yes.
and their core business. Right. Yeah. Cool. So let's talk about exponential organizations, because you're the founder and chairman of ExoWorks and OpenEXO, which both help companies implement lessons from your book, Exponential Organizations, by emulating the world's fastest growing companies. So I'm curious if you could give us a brief description of what an exponential organization is, and maybe a little backstory of how you even made these discoveries.
Sure. So, I was building out Singularity University, and we noticed that we have a massive forcing function in technology coming. I call it 20 Gutenberg moments, because in the 15th century, the printing press fundamentally changed the world, right? And we call that a Gutenberg moment because it totally transformed society. Well, blockchain totally transformed society. Solar energy completely transformed. Autonomous cars, drones, CRISPR. We have about 20 of those hitting us at the same time. And I think this breaks every institution and mechanism by which we currently manage the world.
Mm,
Um, and so, if in the face of that, we have to kind of build completely new organizations. And we noticed that starting in about 2007, 2008, with the advent of Amazon Web Services, you could take computing off the balance sheet and make it a variable cost. And we noticed a completely new breed of organization growing, like the Ubers and Airbnbs, where they were scaling the organization as fast as you can scale technology. Right?
mm,
In the past, you could scale technology, but the organization was painfully incremental and linear to build, and sublinear as you get bigger. But now we're seeing these new TED, for example, leveraging community. And so look at TED. It was a 1,000-person conference once a year. Chris Anderson takes it over and does three things: establishes an MTP, ideas worth spreading. Then he puts all the TED Talks on YouTube, leveraging rich media. Then he allows anybody in the TED community to create a TEDx event. And in 10 years, he has a global media brand, which he's done at a cost of zero. Okay,
mm.
so you can take an established environment, blow it open to a global level at almost no cost. That is a magical thing to be able to do. So the ability to scale an organization super fast is one characteristic. The economic thesis behind an EXO is that the internet has allowed us to drop the cost of demand and acquisition of customers radically. Online marketing, referral marketing, every Silicon Valley startup is trying to go for a viral loop, right? What EXOs have figured out is how do you drop the cost of supply exponentially? Think about Airbnb. The cost of adding a room to their inventory is near zero. If you're Hyatt, you have to build a hotel. Same with Uber, same with Waze, etc. So we're having now a new breed of companies where they've learned to drop the marginal cost of supply very dramatically, which is the denominator in the value equation, which means your market cap explodes. So that's why the market cap is so high. So what we did was we looked at the fastest growing 200 companies, and said, how are they doing it? What
Mm.
techniques are they using? And that's essentially the inductive reasoning that emerged in the EXO model with the MTP, 5 externalities, 5 internal mechanisms, and that comprises the model.
Yeah, that's an incredible line of thought. And it's interesting to note how this is really just a consequence, as well as riding on the wave of exponential technologies
Right.
and taking advantage of them. Yeah, I think it'd be really helpful if you could super quickly, like in a few seconds, for each of the 11 attributes, just describe them. We've talked about
Sure.
the MTP. There's 5 external and 5 internal.
Sure. So the MTP is the most important, and we found that every EXO had one. So that's one. Then you have 5 externalities, and those are staff on demand, like Uber not hiring its own staff, TED leveraging community and crowd, XPRIZE leverages the crowd, right?
Mm,
Um, Google leverages algorithms. Facebook leverages algorithms heavily also. Airbnb is leveraging other people's assets. Okay, and then there's digital engagement models, gamification, incentive prizes to keep really close to the customer. So those form to the acronym SCALE: staff on demand, community crowd, algorithms, leveraged assets, engagement. And those are the externalities you use one or more of to scale very quickly. It allows you to keep a very small feature footprint. Think about Airbnb. The fundamental process is to match driver and passenger. And because of the way they do it, they don't do it inside the organization. It happens out in the wild. And by enabling that with technology, they can scale infinitely. right?
Yep.
So those are the externalities. Then we found there were 5 internal mechanisms. One was the interface between the company and the outside world. Apple with its app store developers, Facebook with its self provisioning of
Mm.
products and services. Then there's real time dashboards. We find that these companies are instrumented in real time because if you're doing well or doing badly, you better know super fast. You don't want to wait too long, like we work, and find out that your unit metrics aren't working. Meanwhile, you're scaling super fast, right?
Mm.
So real time dashboards. The third is experimentation, which is the whole lean startup thinking, running nonstop small experiments, testing hypotheses, and then with a feedback loop. And taking risk, really important to encourage the taking of risk inside the organization.
Yep.
The fourth is autonomy, decentralized org structures. Letting, one of the reasons Facebook was so successful is Mark let the developers take code right to the live site in the early days. And that was incredibly inspiring. Every developer wanted to go work there. And they rolled out features 10 times faster than Yahoo or MySpace in the early days and beat the world. Right. And so that kind of a giving autonomy to the people and making decisions as close to the edge as possible is very powerful. And that way also scale. And the final one is social technologies like Zoom, Slack, Yammer, Chatter that allows you we have good evidence that peer-to-peer collaboration in a company is much more valuable than traditional top-down communication. So those are 5 internal mechanisms that map to the acronym IDEAS. So you have MTP, scale for the externalities, ideas for the internal attributes.
Yeah, it's such a
If you're
valuable
if you're a
framework.
startup, you should be doing all of them. Okay. And if you're a big company, we found that if you fully implement 4, you get a 10x improvement in your organization.
Interesting. Yeah, and so that was going to be my next question. How do you use this? I mean, it's interesting that you note that a startup should be doing all of these. Like, but is that always possible? Like, what if there's limited resources? How do you determine which to prioritize? Or maybe you do all of them, but you focus on some more than others. How should people think about that?
Yeah, so I'll give you the way we've laid it out, and it actually has held up remarkably well. Number one step when doing a startup is pick your MTP. Is
Right.
it curing cancer? Is it ways of solve traffic globally? Is it Facebook connect the world socially? Whatever it
But
is.
by the way, given that that one is so important, how would you recommend people? What process can people go through to come up with their MTP?
This is like a soul searching thing on I'll give you 3 ways of thinking about it. If you had to wake up at 6 a.m. every morning to work on a problem, which problem would it be?
Hmm.
Which problem gives you that excitement to wake up that early? If you could spend $1 billion to solve one problem globally, which one would it be?
Hmm.
Right. And so if you had unlimited free time, what would you work on? Where do you think you can add the most contribution? Elon has 3: go to space, solve energy, solve transportation.
Hmm.
But that's Elon. He's a bit crazy. Okay. So I'll stick with one. Most people stick with one, etc. So you pick your MTP, number 1. Number 2, you either create a community around that MTP, say it's curing cancer, or you join communities that are trying to solve that problem, and you get connected into a community, or you create a community around it. Number 3, you put together a founding team with a few key roles: engineering, business thinking, a product, etc. And number 4 is your breakthrough idea, and the breakthrough idea has to be at least 10x better than the status quo. If it's 10% better than the market will ignore you. If it's 10 times better, the market cannot ignore you, right? And so it should be that much better. And then you start following lean startup thinking, minimum viable product, iterating. And then once you've got the MVP set up, and then you start applying the rest of the EXO attributes, dashboards, engagement, gamification, etc. So that's the way we talk about it when guiding startups to be operating on this mode. We actually have a platform called EXO Builder that allows anybody to show up, put in their MTP, plug in their lean startup thinking, tick off when they have. It's like an ERP for building a startup, and it's crowd building essentially. So
Wow.
we were just acquired that and launching it. They've already trained 50,000 entrepreneurs on how to think about building new ideas.
Is that something that people could use today?
Yeah. If you go to, it'll be live at Exo Builder at some point, but right now it's the we haven't merged it in yet, but it's canoe, canou.io, canoe.io.
Okay, great. I'll be sure to include that in the show notes. But that's a super interesting way to, and you can see the exponential thinking behind kind of crowdsourcing that to provide value. That's
Huge.
brilliant. Cool. So I'm curious. You've worked with a lot of startups, entrepreneurs. What do you think is the attribute or set of attributes that people tend to overlook the most?
I think there's two. I think there's one is the execution and integrity of execution. Okay, so
Hmm.
meaning simply that I say I'm going to send you a note about this product tonight, and I don't do it. I get it done tomorrow, a week later, or whatever. I'm terribly bad at this because I'm so busy. People have learned, like, he says he's going to do it, but he's not really going to do it. But when I actually get it done, the outcomes are huge, because people rely to learn to trust you. So following through on your word and having integrity around the execution of what you say you're going to do versus what you actually do is absolutely one of the biggest ones. The
Wow.
second, I think, is the emotional intelligence that's needed to build a startup. It's one of the hardest things that anybody will ever do, because the definition of building a startup is breaking all the existing rules and stepping outside all the existing boxes and paradigms. And that creates a huge amount of stress and uncertainty, meeting your monthly payroll in the face of all of this, etc. And dealing with the mental stress and anxiety coming from that is the second part that I think is incredibly undervalued. Um, I mean, talk to me about a successful entrepreneur who's not gone through massive mental anxiety, right?
Yeah.
And it's just not there.
Hmm. Do you have any recommendations on how someone can improve their emotional intelligence, how to deal with those moments? Because they're inevitable in entrepreneurship. Like, it's so hard. I mean, I don't know if either you have recommendations or how you deal with it for yourself.
So I do a great deal of meditation.
Yeah.
I've done Vipassana meditation, the
Yep.
10-day retreat. I've done that a couple of
Oof, love
times.
those.
I've dabbled in psychedelics, which is a
Hell yeah.
great shortcut. I've gone through like Tony Robbins landmark education type stuff that cleans up your past junk. There's a program one of my favorite programs is called the Mankind Project, which is a weekend where they take your psyche, turn it inside out, do like an oil, lube, and filter, and then
What?
to put it all back together again in 48 hours, which
What
is
the hell?
super intense, but one of the most powerful things I've ever done. It's a nonprofit structure.
Oh my God.
And so I think you need to take a deep look and clean out your own uh, uh, mental and emotional difficulties and baggage that we all have inherited. And that then leaves you clearer to take on the big challenge,
Hmm.
right? Because otherwise you're like Tiger Woods. You're unbelievably great at one thing and you're terrible in other parts of your life. And finding that balance is really, really important. Um, and so then I've done a bunch of psychedelics to kind of transform and connect yourself to the divine. And then you use microdosing as a maintenance model to keep yourself in the right tuned in the right way.
There you go. I'm
So
microdosing right
those
now.
are my recommendations for people.
Yeah, that is the way to transform. That's funny. I've done silent retreats. I've been to Tony Robbins seminars, and that's been the greatest contribution to my personal growth. And yeah, and psychedelics definitely give you the perspective and renewed perspective on your entire life. So can vouch for all of those, except the I forgot what it was called, but the one where your brain goes inside out, something crazy. I want to try that one. I'm missing out. But great, awesome. Salim, one thing I'm curious about, you wrote Exponential Organizations in 2014, right? So, I mean, a lot has happened since then. A lot has changed. If you were to
Yeah.
rewrite the book today, what would you have included in it, or what additional discoveries have you made that you'd add to that book?
Yeah, great question. So I'm actually working on the second edition of the book right now,
Oh, nice.
and Peter is co-authoring it with me.
Hell yeah.
He was actually supposed to be a co-author on the first edition, and then he had another book coming out, and his publisher freaked out. So that was the story there. So the second edition, what I've learned in 7 years is that the 10 attributes are remarkably uh, stable. Like it seems like that model is really powerful in terms of which ones, and there's some difference in emphasis. Like for example, community turns out to be super important to build around your early stage startup, right? Because you get feedback, you can hire people, etc. We have a couple of new things like design thinking that is a big deal,
Hmm.
and networked or platform business models or ecosystems instead of traditional operating companies. That's kind of all built in, but the attributes themselves have held up remarkably well. We actually measured the Fortune 100 by their EXO score, So I went on CNBC Squawk Box and did this. And we find that the top 10 most flexible, agile, adaptable companies have outperformed the bottom 10 by like 6.5 times on profitability, 11 times on return on equity and stuff. Just radically outperformed the other. The market cap of the top 10 has gone from 5x the market cap of the bottom 10 to 16 times the market cap of the
Oof.
bottom 10 in 7 years.
Wow.
That's for big companies that are using, because as the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt is going to drive market value, right? And except big companies are traditionally structured not to change. And so that's the enormous challenge facing every big company today. I think the need, what the Corona has done is highlight the incredible need to be very agile and flexible. So Marriott hotels had to lay off like half of their staff globally, and Airbnb changed a little bit, added some extra cleaning costs, and boom, kept right on going. So I think the need for this model becomes pervasive. We're calling this the decade of the EXO. My thesis is by the end of this decade, either you're using these attributes or you won't be in business.
Yeah. Oh man, that's something that still stings from this year's Abundance 360 conference, where Peter said that there's two type of companies that will exist in the next 10 years: those that adopt exponentials and those that die.
Yes. Yes, it's the value creation is too powerful and the upside is too critical. And each of these technologies is growing exponentially, but where they intersect, the value creation. Take cryptography and computation, and boom, you have Bitcoin. And look at the way that's going, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it circling back to what you said earlier, where you have these existing systems and they're very inefficient, and it's much more efficient to create these new systems. I mean, that's exactly what's going to happen. And these new systems, these new startups, by the way, your biggest advantage as a startup is that you don't have to turn your massive Titanic ship around. You can start heading in whatever direction you want. Uh,
Right.
and that's
And
that's
that's
one of
the
the biggest
incredible
advantages.
power of it, because you can now operate on that basis in a very agile way, shift to your MTP and then just go, right? And I
Yeah,
think that's the incredible power there.
go head on. Um, all right, cool. Last few questions, Salim. One thing I want to touch on is that we've talked a lot about exponential thinking and linear thinking, but I'm curious how you would describe the difference between the two, and if you could also touch on what the moonshot mindset is and its importance.
Yeah. So, most of our education and intuition and training about the world is linear. And Peter talks about it as if you take, Ray Kurzweil actually originated this metaphor. You take 30 steps linearly, you'll get to the other side of your apartment. And we can all predict really well where is a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that progression. We're really good at linear extrapolation. So we default to that a lot. But if you take 30 doubling steps, 2, 4, 6, 8, at step 30, you've gone 1 billion meters. You're 26 times around the world, right? Which is a little further than the end of your condo. And it's really hard to gauge where is a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that projection, right? Yet more and more of the world, driven by this information paradigm, is operating on that basis. Okay, take Alibaba, right, in China. They just had their big sales day a few months ago. $40 billion of e-commerce in one day. And I'll suggest to you that most people cannot grok that number. We
Yeah.
can't cognate how big of a number that is in terms of sales in one day. Forget trying to talk to any traditional retailing executive about it, right? They just can't cope. That's like 10 years of sales for their chain or something. And so that difference is the fundamental nature of what's possible with exponentials, which is why you have to be as young as possible, right? So this is why you're young. There's some law that you have to be under 25 years old to program on the blockchain, right? I don't know where that's written, but
I'm
it's like it's
24. Wow, I got
there you go. You're
validation.
just sneaking under the bar there. But in 2 years, you'll be over the hill.
Oh
So
God.
that kind of ability to think of it in those terms is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And stay that.
Hmm.
Look at the way Elon works. Elon works very simply. He looks at a technology that's growing exponentially, aims 10 years out. Where will that technology be in 10 years on a doubling pattern? And let's build a company to intercept that curve.
Wow.
That's it. Whether it's neural implants, whether it's solar energy, whether it's battery technology, AI, that's his
Hmm.
methodology. It's pretty simple if you have the guts and the gumption to project out and then stick with that curve. So the need and understanding of exponentials is absolutely
Yeah.
critical and a starting point for entrepreneurship today. Because if you're not leveraging exponentials, somebody else is, and you'll be done. The second part of your question was moonshots.
Yes. The moonshot
Okay.
mindset. Yeah.
So the way we think about that is if MTP is your canvas, right? Then moonshots are the pictures and the targets you paint on that canvas. So
Mm.
Elon's MTP is one of his is going to space. We should become a spacefaring species. The moonshots are okay. Let's build the most reusable rocket in the world.
Mm.
Let's then drop the cost of a launch from 600 million, which was NASA, down to 60 million, which he's now done, et cetera, et cetera. You come up with these crazy moonshots along the way that are that are waypoints along that journey to an MTP.
Mm. Super valuable. One thing I want to highlight here is that in my own learning, one of the most valuable things I've learned is learning about the different exponential technologies like AI, virtual reality, blockchain, augmented reality, and understanding their potential. And the reason this is so important is because you can more easily see where the world is heading. And by understanding that, it's kind of like all of these technologies become like tools in your arsenal. So the way I'm curious how you approach it, but the way I'm approaching it is that any problem I look at now, I ask like, hey, how can AI solve this problem? How can VR solve this problem? How can blockchain solve this problem? And by understanding these technologies, the potential for solutions that come up are way greater, especially if you can think of how different exponentials can converge and combine together
Yes.
to create an even more powerful solution.
Yeah. If you go back to the founding of Amazon, right? Jeff Bezos looked at the internet. It was growing 2,300% a year and said, if I create an internet company, it's going to grow at the same level because you're going to grow with the underlying technology, which is scaling naturally. Today, we have a dozen technologies that are all doubling. Take drones. Drones are doubling every 9 months in their capability. So
Hmm.
if you build a solution on drones, the underlying capability scales, right? And I'll give you a little real world example here. I was talking to the prime minister of Sri Lanka,
Hmm.
okay, and they were building a new port because Colombo, this capital, has grown massively, and they need a new port. So they're spending like billions of dollars on a new port. And I was like, wait, a drone today can carry 1,000 kilos, but they're doubling every 9 months. Okay, an average container is 20,000 kilos. So in three doublings, you take four drones that can carry 4,000 kilos each, or 5,000 kilos each, on the corner of a container, and you don't need a port. You just lift it off the boat and put it onto a train or onto a flatbed, and you're done. You don't need a port. And you could literally see his mind break, going, "Shit! I've just spent like how many billions of dollars commissioning a port when I won't need it at all." Right? That's the kind of thinking that gives you the unbelievable breakthrough companies that can come from this next generation, and the potential is literally limitless. And this is why Peter gets so excited. This is why we get so excited, because we're firm believers that technology is a major driver of progress in the world. In fact, technology may be the only major driver of progress. And now we have a dozen technologies all moving super fast. That gets us super excited about the potential for the future.
Yeah, it's insane. The only in today's world, the only constant is change, and that rate of change is accelerating primarily because faster computers are helping to build faster computers.
Exactly
So
right.
it's wild. Cool. One thing I'm very curious to dive into and how you think is how you think about problems, right? Like when you come across or you're confronted with a massive problem, like what are some of the mindsets, systems, tools, or even strategies that you think about or use in order to come up with potential solutions and on how to execute on them? Maybe you have an
So let me
example too.
classify the problems into uh, external problems and personal ones that I'm dealing with in my head, right? Like,
Okay.
how am I going to get this piece of thing done, or how do I solve for this problem, etc.
Right. Yeah.
The external problems, what I tend to do is convene a group around it
Hmm.
and mastermind it and get a group effort against it, because several people focusing on it will blow away any one individual's capability to deal with that future. So getting a crowd or a community around that attacking that problem is going to blow away any particular individual. And the use of design thinking and all of the workshopping techniques that are possible at a personal level, if I'm dealing with, okay, how am I going to get this strategic alliance done, or how am I going to get this investor over the line, or how am I going to solve for this employee problem or whatever, typically I don't try and risk my cognitive conscious brain. I will
Mm.
typically say, I'm going to go to bed, ask my pillow, and tell the pillow, wake me up with the answer. And then for the night, my subconscious is working on it, which is way more powerful than my conscious self. And most of the time, I'll have the answer in the morning.
Yeah, yeah. Your pillow's like your second brain.
And it's way, way, way smarter than I am. And the level below that is your really your conscious soul level, which is the your superego. And that really kind of requires psychedelics and other things to get access to. But
Oh
that's
yeah.
probably another podcast.
Yep, yep. I could do a whole podcast on psychedelics and their power. Um, cool. Last two questions for you, Salim. Um, this one is like, let's say that you had the ability to send a voice message or a text message to every single young entrepreneur across the world. What would you send them? Like, what concept would you teach them, or what advice would you give them?
Oh, wow. Okay, number one, find your passion and go for it. Number two, do not let your elders tell you what to do, because they just don't know. They just can't know, right? Like when I think about the difference in my life compared to my parents, it's completely different life, and the next generation is the gap is even bigger. I
Yeah.
think of kids below 12 years old as not even human; they're a whole other species. Like, there's no piece of advice that my grandparents can give my 10-year-old son to navigate his life, like zero. So the younger generation has this unbelievable opportunity and actually an obligation to take over. If I could wave a wand, I would say the president of the U.S. cannot be older than 40 years old,
Hmm. Wow.
because the older generation simply cannot get their head around what's happening today. And you look at the discourse with Mark talking to Congress and trying to get people to understand it, they just can't. So you have to have people that understand the future, and the younger generation, I think, has a much better grasp of the future than the older generation. So I would say find your passion, ignore the elders, and go build. Just go build.
Yeah, go build, execute on your dreams. Cool. And I hope my parents listen to this episode so that they can understand why I do so many things that are against their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, look at Vitalik Buterin, right? 18 years old, ignores his professors, and Ethereum is now a $500 billion ecosystem,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I was not doing that when I was 18.
Yep. No, exactly. It's just harder for them to understand the potential of many of these things,
Not
but
harder, impossible,
impossible. Yeah.
impossible.
Yeah, that's why I think one of the smartest or most important things I've learned is to try to identify what to listen to and what not to listen to when it comes to
Yeah.
like my parents or anyone else, because you have to be very, very cautious and aware. But cool, awesome, Salim. Last question for you. So I'm curious what impact you want to have in the invention of the future. How will you invent the future?
I want to create the social and systemic societal structures that enable the future. Um, which means, what do our new institutions look like? Because every institution, as I said earlier, by which we run the world is broken today. And we have actually the expertise and the cognitive capability in our ecosystem to actually transform our institutions. So that's actually what we're about. So my hope would be that we go through a journey of rebuilding our institutional fabric globally, new monetary systems, new legal systems, new healthcare systems, new journalism systems, monetary systems, dispute resolution mechanisms, and that becomes the new safety net for the world. Because it's like the Gartner hype cycle, right? You have this inflated. We're kind of in the trough of Western civilization right now, as we move from scarcity to abundance, and we're going to go through a period of heavy disillusionment, etc. And the question is, how can we come out of that and reduce the amplitude and damage that it may do? We found throughout history that civilizations got to a very advanced point, and then they all hit a boundary condition, like the Easter Island folks ran out of water, the Romans had one issue, etc. And all of a sudden, they all collapsed super suddenly. And if you talk to the Yuval Hararis and Neil Fergusons of the world, all those conditions are there now. And how do we go through this next transformation without going through 500 years of the Dark Ages? I think is the work that's left to do, which means new projects, new leaders, and a completely new way of thinking, which is why I love podcasts like the one you're putting together. This new way of thinking is critically important to get at. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for coming on, Salim. You never fail to blow my mind. So that is the greatest piece of gratitude I can express to everyone or anyone. So thank you for that. Yeah, last thing, where can people learn more about you, what you're working on, and maybe some of the resources you offer to help entrepreneurs?
Sure. Website is openexo.com,
Hmm.
openexo. We offer free training for the foundations course that gives you the basics of the exponentials model.
Great.
And I'm at Salim Ismail on Twitter and various other social media where you can track what I'm doing. I work with Peter on the board of X Prize, and going after systemic change. Right now, we're starting our latest sprint, which is how do you transform education, and what
Mm.
should education look like is the question we're trying to answer there. So for the folks that are interested, come and join the community. It's free to join, and we've got 8,200 people in 130 countries working on transforming society.
Oh, super cool. Well, that sounds like a great community to be a part of, and thank you for organizing and everything that you do to transform civilization. Beautiful MTP, and yeah, thank you, Salim. This was super fun.
Thanks, Julian. Good to be here.